Good morning. Can you all hear me? All right. I don't like to use microphones because I project a lot naturally, so I have to hold it far away from me. Welcome, come on in, have a seat. We're just getting started. My name is Mike Charnoff, and I am Mary Washington, class of 1995, and I had the pleasure of spending another year here working in the admissions office with some of our fine administrative staff before I moved on. And I've been serving for the past several years on the board of directors of the Alumni Association. So welcome all of you this morning. I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker today for our Alumni College lecture, Stephen Farnsworth. Dr. Farnsworth, some of you may not know this, before his distinguished academic career, he was a journalist. And it's a fascinating part of his past, and I don't think that's what he's going to chat about today necessarily, but you should ask him about it a little bit later. Dr. Farnsworth earned his PhD at Georgetown University, and he is a professor and director here of the Center for Leadership and Media Studies. Specializes in American government and the presidency, media and politics, and elections. Today, Dr. Farnsworth is going to discuss his sixth book, which is 6 more books than I've written. It is the Presidential Communication and Character from Clinton and Cable to Twitter and Trump, which is obviously a highly topical area. And that was just published this spring by Routledge. Previous books include Spinner in Chief, How Presidents Sell Their Policies and Themselves, and Political Support in a Frustrated America. That was back in 2003. He also co-authored The Global President, International Media and the U.S. Government, The Nightly News Nightmare, Media Coverage of U.S. Presidential Elections, and the Mediated Presidency, Television Use and Presidential Governance. Dr. Farnsworth has written dozens of scholarly articles on the presidency, and you may have very well read his remarks in your local newspaper or heard him commenting on the political disaster of the day on your local news radio. I know I have. Dr. Farnsworth has been the Canada and U.S. Fulbright Research Chair in Public Policy at McGill University in Montreal, and has been named WAPL Research Fellow here at Mary Washington for 2018 through 2020. I think I mentioned to you that he has some background in journalism. Dr. Farnsworth provided U.S. government-funded reporter training, seminars in Ukraine, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Lithuania, Armenia, and Estonia. He's a world traveler far beyond me. Dr. Farnsworth has also enjoyed accolades here at the university. He's been the recipient of the Virginia Outstanding Faculty Award, and that's from the State Council on Higher Education. And here at Mary Washington, he's received the Mary W. Pinschmidt Teaching Award, the Alumni Association Outstanding Young Faculty Award, and the Richard Palmieri Outstanding Professor Award. So I'm glad you're all here with us this morning. For those of you who can't get enough of Dr. Farnsworth, and I know I can't, you can join us over at the Political Science Department in Monroe at 10:30, and we can sort of continue the conversation there. So again, welcome all of you here this morning. Welcome everyone live streaming on the internet. Hi, Mom. And without further ado, Dr. Farnsworth.
Thanks so much, Mike. It's great to see you here today, and it's great to see everyone here today to talk about the presidential process of communication. As we think about presidential communication, I think we're seeing a very important trend that is changing our orientation towards the presidency. And that deals with the increasing attention being paid to character. One of the problems with modern media, in my view, is the focus on more trivial aspects of politics. If you want to learn a lot about an issue, say for a presidential candidate, where they will take the country, what they're going to do, it's really, really a challenge. You have to go out and search that material much more than seeing it front center in the news that you're likely to consume, because we tend to focus in the news on the trivial. It's junk food journalism, for lack of a better way to put it. You're talking about an orientation towards the issues of who's ahead in the polls, who's behind in the polls, the issue of how people are reacting to things. Everything happens for some other reason. And so you have this kind of insider story of a candidate, the drama of the campaign chair, or which state they're in, or which constituency they're trying to focus, rather than giving people a clear sense of what they are going to get if this person or this other person becomes president. This other issue, the issue of character, has become more and more important because talking about issues, that's complicated. And so the reporters, remember, in fairness to journalism, there's a much greater pressure on journalists than there ever used to be. When I was a reporter, I wrote a story, but I had several hours to figure out what the story was about. I could make my calls, I could talk to some people, I could make some more calls, and by the end of the day, I had a story. I don't have a whole day when we think about journalism today. I have 5 minutes, and I've got to get it online. And then I have to update it, and I have to update it. And so there's a great problem with this in terms of accuracy. But there's also a great problem with respect to the sophistication of what's being presented. Perhaps in your days as a college student, you might have known people who turned in first drafts as papers. Present company accepted, I'm sure. But the reality is journalists are always having to turn in first drafts. And they're not even turning in complete first drafts. They're turning in the first paragraph of the first draft, and then the second paragraph, and so on online. So you have a constant challenge for journalists. And remember, there are steadily fewer and fewer people who are journalists because of the business of news, the challenges that the media environment is facing. Now, this is why there's a temptation to talk a lot more about character. Because character isn't sophisticated in terms of its conversation, and it's something that the candidates themselves are trying to present. They have a biography of who they are. They have the story of their personality, and generally speaking, it's a nice picture. Rarely does a president talk about the past in their own personal background in a negative way. Bill Clinton, you may recall, had a really horrific childhood. His father died in a car crash before he was born. His stepfather beat his mother. They were always struggling financially. But when Bill Clinton talks about his background, he says he comes from a place called Hope, Arkansas. The challenges of Barack Obama as a young man, also not exactly made for television. He saw his father a couple of times in his whole life. His parents had profound disagreements, and he was raised by grandparents, in a mother who was financially struggling. This is a story that isn't told as much as Barack Obama, the first African-American editor of the Harvard Law Review. And so candidates go out of their way to tell the stories about who they are. And when we think about character in our presidents, we're also thinking about these sort of positive stories much of the time. You may recall some of these stories we were told as children. Maybe they're apocryphal, but there are stories that sort of shape our vision of who we are as a people. Because a president is a representation of the whole country. I mean, our Constitution is set up with our system of shared power and shared responsibility. But when you think about the country, it's really a very presidency-focused process in terms of who represents us, who is who we are, who has in his or her grasp the aspirations of our people and our place. think about the struggles that the presidents faced and how they often succeeded. Think about Lincoln. Think about Washington. Think about FDR. You know, the stories of how they and us together overcame the challenges of very difficult times. And this brings me to 2016 and the choices that were being made. And I think that as we look at these four presidents that I look at in this book, we see that each of them were pretty effective at using the media environment of their time to present themselves in a positive light. And again, a lot of that positive focus is with respect to character, with respect to who they are as people. Bill Clinton was very, very good at the cable talk show, which was a vehicle that he used a lot during his presidency to communicate with people. And it's really important to understand that the Bill Clinton presidency, in any reasonable expectation, would never have happened. 4 years before Bill Clinton was elected, back in 1988, there was a fellow named Gary Hart who got into trouble because of an extramarital affair involving a woman, Donna Rice. Now, in a story of life imitating art, a photo of this couple appears. They're on vacation on a boat called the Monkey Business. Sometimes you can't make this stuff up. I sometimes wonder how fiction writers who cover political issues can ever survive, because what actually happens is so unbelievable. How can you go beyond it as you write your fiction? So 4 years before Bill Clinton is elected president, a presidential candidate, and by the way, Gary Hart was the favorite in the polls at the time of this scandal, disappears. It falls apart. The Hart campaign is over. 4 years later, Bill Clinton comes along, and we learn about a woman named Jennifer Flowers. And there's a tape of Bill Clinton and Jennifer Flowers having a conversation about questions that are being raised about the possibility that they were having an affair. Jennifer Flowers was a television reporter in Arkansas. Bill Clinton was governor. So Jennifer Flowers and Bill Clinton are on the phone. And the tape says, Bill Clinton on the tape says, if you say it didn't happen and I say it didn't happen, we're good. Okay, so now, try to imagine for a moment Abraham Lincoln having this conversation. Okay, it's not the image that we have. Okay, we know a lot more about today's presidents than we ever did about previous presidents. Maybe John F. Kennedy made Bill Clinton look like a choir boy, but in all honesty, I kind of doubt it. But we don't know the whole story about many of these presidents. But we do, with modern media, know a lot about these people. And so what Bill Clinton could do is nothing short of amazing, right? I mean, 4 years after a presidential campaign is destroyed by an extramarital affair, Bill Clinton is elected president despite one. And there was another issue, too, by the way, with respect to character in Bill Clinton. That was the issue about how he oriented himself towards Vietnam. He was of a generation that had to deal with the question of how to handle being drafted. And he decided that he would keep his, quote, political viability, unquote, in place by opening himself up to the draft. Bill Clinton had gotten himself a special gig with the National Guard in Arkansas, not unlike George W. Bush with the Texas National Guard, not unlike the son of Lloyd Benson with the Texas National Guard. Bill Clinton had to deal with the Arkansas National Guard. He was never going to have to go to Vietnam. But he said that that might be seen negatively in his political career. This is a 20-year-old college student, okay, making this decision, worried about his political viability. And he says, I'm going to leave myself open to the draft. So what Bill Clinton does is he says, thanks, no thanks to the National Guard. His name is put into the lottery for the draft. Bill Clinton, some might say one of the luckiest people on the face of the earth, gets a high draft number, doesn't have to go to Vietnam. Okay. And then Bill Clinton, of course, despite that scandal, despite the scandal with Jennifer Flowers, despite the scandal with Paula Jones, despite the scandal with James Doe number 5, he somehow gets elected president. Okay? Because he feels our pain. And this speaks to who he is as a person, right? Bill Clinton said that he could connect with people. He understood the troubles of the economic challenges of the time. So, we elected him. And he didn't start behaving better once he became president, as we all learned. But the part of the character that we thought was pretty compelling, that is that he understood us, is the kind of thing that really came out through cable. The talk shows, Phil Donahue and things like that. Arsenio, he plays the saxophone. We should elect him. He must be a decent guy. The same thing happens with the other presidents who come along. George W. Bush, I think, very well suited to Fox News, which is on a rise during the George W. Bush years. He really could connect with them. And again, one of the things that people liked about George W. Bush was character. He seemed like a no-nonsense, honest guy. In American politics, we tend to want what we don't have. And Bill Clinton seemed like kind of a disreputable person in terms of how he behaved. No one saw that about George W. Bush. He had a problem in his youth, but he said he stopped drinking once he became a father. And all indications are that's exactly what happened. So we saw with George W. Bush this sort of genuine person. A little swagger maybe to him, but somebody who maybe operated on a more elevated moral plane than Bill Clinton. But there were questions of how good George W. Bush was at the job. Then you had to deal with Katrina, the occupation of Iraq, the financial crisis. Maybe we shouldn't just elect a guy who seems like one of us. So we try again. Another character move. We go to Barack Obama, who seemed like a competent guy compared to George W. Bush in particular. Now, one of the things that, that happened with John McCain is that he was beaten twice by George W. Bush. He ran for president in 2000 and lost the nomination to George W. Bush. And then when McCain got the nomination in his own right in 2008, George W. Bush is also responsible for his defeat because of the unpopularity of Bush at that time. Made it very, very hard for John McCain, a genuine American hero with a very compelling personal story, ever to become president. It was so much more a reaction to Bush. So Obama becomes president. And he seems like a competent fellow, again, when we're talking about presidential character, but he doesn't seem to really connect with people who are hurting and struggling, particularly in terms of the industrial Midwest, particularly in terms of working class whites. There's a feeling abroad in the country that Barack Obama doesn't really get them. And that's where we see the opportunity emerging for a different kind of character, Donald Trump, to emerge. Because what Donald Trump made very clear was that he was going to look out for people who hadn't been getting all that much attention before. Now, you can come to your own conclusions about whether or not he's actually doing that, but that was his campaign message. He goes to West Virginia and tells people that coal is going to be back. And as president, he's doing what he can to restore coal as an energy source, even though it's much higher polluting per BTU, even though it is dangerous to produce, difficult to transport, it matters not. Coal is, quote, back. Once upon a time, conservatives believed in free markets, but we'll leave that aside for the moment. There is the idea that the industrial Midwest, has lost a lot of jobs to trade. This is a common view. It's probably more true that those jobs were lost to automation. More jobs were probably lost to automation than to trade. That's what my friends who are economists tell me. But even so, some jobs were lost to trade, and Trump promises to bring those back. And so you can see a series of issues of efforts to undermine trade deals, to break away from traditional agreements, the North American Free Trade Agreement, the World Trade Organization, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, whole series of things. So what you got with Donald Trump is not the kind of upbeat vision of the future, but rather a more defensive, backward-looking vision that spoke to the anxieties of a lot of people, particularly in the industrial Midwest, particularly working-class whites. Now, when we think about presidential character, historically, we had this idea that presidents were this, this sort of representation of the national will, that they were somehow the best of us. Donald Trump did not campaign as the best of us. He didn't talk about that kind of hope and change and optimism for the future. It's perhaps a darker vision than you saw with Barack Obama 8 years earlier. But it spoke to where we were at the time. And one should add, it's perfect for Twitter. It is absolutely perfect for Twitter. Twitter allows, just curious, how many of you are on Twitter? Only a few. Okay. So what Twitter offers you is basically a chance to put your bumper sticker online. It's just a few words, a sentence maybe, 2 sentences. They've expanded it a little bit. And so it's perfect for an expression of anger, an expression of simplification, an expression of something that is really limited in its depth. And this is good for a politician who doesn't know much about issues. It's good for a president who doesn't want to engage in debate. It's good for a president who wants to insult, attack. It's a vehicle for toughness. So in many ways, our media technology has given us presidents, one after another, who are very effective at responding to the media environment of the day. Getting back to Obama for a moment, what Obama was good at in terms of the media was connecting through social media like YouTube and Facebook. He was, shooting hoops and talking about policy. One of the smartest things that Obama ever did as a presidential communicator was his Final Four picks, March Madness. He was totally into that, and he got a segment on ESPN every year talking about what he thought what his bracket was, and how it was going to look. Now, he made some mistakes. He was way too pro-Duke for any reasonable calculation. But be that as it may, he had the idea that going to sports, something he knew something about, something he was actually pretty good at, was a great vehicle for connecting with people who might not pay attention to him, might not listen to him all that much. And it's part of the reason that Barack Obama had relatively high approval ratings. He didn't have an entirely successful presidency. I think you can look to the Obama presidency and see stumbles here and there, particularly with respect to Syria and the Middle East. But as a whole, he leaves office with very high approval ratings. Now, I want to talk a little bit about data, and I have some data tables to present this. But so the fundamental argument that I'm making is that we're seeing a movement towards this conversation about character, which I think undermines our ability to think about issues. And so we're making decisions based on who we like. Now, Donald Trump was not all that well liked in the country, but he had the good fortune to run against somebody else who was also not well liked in the country. And that's part of the reason why he finishes first, at least in the Electoral College. Now, one of the things that's important to recognize, these are data from national surveys. Some of these are from the Pew Research Center. Some are from the Washington Post surveys. Some are from Gallup. I always have a source here. And this is all going to be available online as I understand it. So you'll be able to come back and look at these in greater detail if you like. You don't have to photograph them on the way by or anything. Or you can just email me and I'll shoot the slides over to you. The point here that I'm trying to make with these surveys, first of all, notice that the internet really isn't as big a deal as you might think in terms of where people are getting news about elections. Now, many of you who may not be on the internet as much as your children or your grandchildren probably already know this. Because when you think about who's voting, when you think about who's following along with the presidential election, television is still very, very influential. There's been a great decline in newspapers if we were to go back to the 1990s, but the internet is pretty consistent. But the other thing that I want to point out on the second point here in the slide is the extent to which the fact that people doubt the media is very widespread. It isn't just conservatives thinking that the media are unfair. Liberals also think that the media are unfair. The more conservative, moderate Democrats, even most of them, think the media these are not fair outlets of news. So when we hear about all this sort of skepticism of the mass media, I think that in the political conversation in this country, I don't think a lot of people recognize that that opinion is very widely shared across ideological boundaries. I think most people hear a lot about conservatives angry about the media. Liberals are mad too. Now, there are limits to how presidents can shape the narrative about their presidencies and about who they are as people. And this is a question about Obama as a Muslim. The data here, and these are from Pew surveys, show us that Obama as president struggled to frame the narrative that he was a Christian. There was a lot of skepticism being raised, particularly in conservative media, about Obama maybe being a Muslim. Obama was not a Muslim any more than he was born outside the United States. But the challenge of hearing something that's false over and over again and somehow trying to force the truth into that conversation is really apparent when we talk about the uncertainty over Obama's religion. And what's important to recognize is that it isn't just conservatives who consume news in conservative media where they're raising the question that Obama is some foreign Muslim terrorist. It is a widespread belief that we aren't sure what to make of Obama's religion. Notice the don't knows here on the right. In every group, whites, blacks, Republicans, independents, Democrats, I could show you a bunch of others, income levels, education levels, every single group, there is more uncertainty about Obama's religion after a year and a half in the White House than there was when he started. Okay? That's true for every group. And so it isn't just a Fox thing. It isn't just an InfoWars thing. It is where people are. And so if you hear uncertainty often enough, you begin to doubt that the truth really is true. And that's the real challenge that people are dealing with today, because it's the old, maybe it's an apocryphal saying from Mark Twain, that the lie goes all around the world before truth gets its boots on. Well, if he said that in the age of the telegraph, imagine how relevant it is for us today. Now, this is a Harvard study that deals with the question of where the campaign news is focused. This is the 2016 presidential election, and you can see 42% of the stories are focused on the horse race. That is, who's ahead, who's behind, where the polls are. This is a major problem. I have talked about this a lot in one of my other books, The Nightly News Nightmare. This is a constant problem, and it's gotten worse. It's easy for reporters to write about polls. It's easy for reporters to talk about gaming the Electoral College. It is less useful to us than talking about policy. Policy is only 10% of the coverage. It's all strategy and tactics. You wonder why people are cynical about government? Here's part of the answer. You wonder why politicians don't talk about issues? Because they're not going to get on TV if they do. So what do you do as a candidate? You go where the reporters are. They want to talk strategy, you talk strategy. They want to talk about the controversies, you talk about the controversies. Now, people handle controversies in ways that are problematic. The presidential campaign of 2016 is particularly notorious for this. Okay. Yeah. Hillary Clinton made a number of mistakes. That's obvious, I think, to everyone who paid attention to the campaign. The first mistake that she made, in my view, was setting up her own server when she was Secretary of State. If everyone in the cabinet doesn't have a server, is working entirely within the federal government email system, maybe you should too. This is what I tell people. If you're the only one thinking something is true, maybe think about it a little harder. You might be right, but there is some value to reconsidering your position if you're the only one who holds it. And then there were other problems as well. The one I want to draw your attention to, and this again gets back to who people are, is the question of that horrible day when she stumbled after the 9/11 commemoration. This was September 11. She had been a senator from New York at the time of the terrorist attack. She had been then focusing on issues relating to this commemoration. And as she was leaving the event, she left a little early, she kind of stumbled and was kind of picked up by Secret Service men and kind of tossed into the van, and away they drove. It looked like she was very feeble. Turns out that she was sick that day. She was taking some medicine. It didn't agree with her. I mean, I got to say, I don't know. I'm in my mid-50s. I don't have the stamina to run for president. I don't know how 70-year-olds do it. You know, I just don't know how you can get up in the morning and do this day after day. You know, every crowd, every moment. And remember, there is a camera every second you are outside your apartment. There is any sort of snippy remark in traffic or to somebody who's irritating you is a global media moment. How do you handle this? Well, the answer is sometimes not very well. But the problem with that moment with the Clinton campaign was they didn't handle it well. They didn't come forward and say that this had really happened, like they thought there wasn't going to be video or something. Then they took a day and a half to talk about how she was on this medical treatment and so on. So you had this whole sort of scenario of basically not telling the truth. But she wasn't the only one. Now, as part of how we got to the Trump presidency, because I'm going to talk for another 10 minutes or so about President Trump and Twitter and how he's using social media, I want to say one other sort of thing about this sort of larger argument about how Trump is a part of a pattern. When people were asked how they felt about these candidates, they didn't like either one of them much. The thought was that look at good judgment. Trump scores very poorly. These are, this is the question of what candidate quality matters most. And so for people who thought that we needed change, Trump got 83% of those voters. For people who thought that the most important thing is a president who has good judgment or the right experience, Hillary Clinton overwhelmingly won those. Trump also did very, very well with the people who think life for the next generation is going to be worse. By a 2-to-1 margin, the 34% of the electorate who thought that the next generation would have a worse time of it than people today, Trump won those voters. Trump did better with those folks who really thought that America was on the wrong track. But they kind of knew what they were getting. People were asked, would you describe Donald Trump as reckless? 69% of the voters said he was reckless. 43% said Hillary Clinton was reckless. Hillary Clinton had a huge advantage over Trump in terms of being well qualified. But as you can see, people did not expect a great deal in terms of Trump as character. They didn't see either one of these candidates as honest. And so you have an environment where Donald Trump has really struggled to win over much support in the country. This is presidential approval after 12 months in office, because I really want you to see how different things are for Donald Trump. Normally, the first year is your best year as president. People are excited about you being elected. You have people who are elected to Congress who agree with you in many cases. There is kind of a coattail effect. And so you end up with an opportunity to move legislatively in your first year that kind of evaporates in many cases pretty quickly. And so you see that there is a very powerful net approval number for a lot of presidents after the first year. If you think about George W. Bush and 9/11, you think about Lyndon Johnson bringing the country together after the death of JFK and the voting rights and civil rights movements of the 60s and his aggressive response legislatively to that. If you think about John Kennedy, who started television news conferences and connected with the public in a way that really made him very popular, you can see that there is something very, very different about Donald Trump. Gerald Ford, his number, he's the next one up from the worst in this calculation. He pardoned Richard Nixon in that first year. And he took the office in an environment of really kind of difficult economic times. For those of you who are remembering the 1970s, that was a time where there was a lot of economic uncertainty. There was a recession. There was an oil embargo. There were long lines at gas stations. I was a kid during the 70s, and I remember how painful it was to try to get gasoline sometimes. My dad had to time everything so carefully about when to go to the station, which station to go to. For people of that vintage, you know the situation. But Trump's numbers are basically, this is an average where without Trump, the net approval rating, that is positive versus negative, 37 points positive. Trump, after a year, 15 points negative. More people disapprove of his presidency than approve. And the numbers have pretty much stayed the same. In part, I think that Donald Trump still has his base support, but he has done very little to move beyond that. I mean, we can have a conversation in the question and answer about why that might be, but I think fundamentally the idea here is that Donald Trump is not trying to bring in people who are not part of his coalition. He just doesn't focus on that. There's very little that he does to get beyond that 40% of the electorate that really feel positively about him. He does a lot for them, but he doesn't do a lot for the other 60%. Now, there was a great deal of how people feel about Donald Trump is based on character. And I have a couple of slides. This one is about the people who disapprove of Trump, and the next one will be about the people who approve. And so in this particular survey from Gallup, 56% of the people surveyed disapproved of Trump. And then we asked them why. And notice how important character is to this calculation. I draw your attention to the 65% number in terms of why you disapprove. 65% of those who disapproved of President Trump in this survey said it was for personality or personal characteristics. 16% said it was objection to issues primarily. Another 12% broad performance evaluations. Notice how different this is from previous presidents. If you look at the Obama numbers or the Bush numbers, again, when they were about 6 months into their presidencies, you see the same basic pattern. For those two, it was much more about objection on the basis of performance evaluations, generally, or issues. For Trump, far different from the other two, it's about character. And when they said, well, what is it exactly beyond those three general characteristics? People said he's arrogant, he's obnoxious, he's inexperienced, he's looking out for himself. A lot of people had their doubts about whether he was trustworthy or whether he should be using social media. I tend to think social media really helps Trump, but there are a number of people in the country who think that Trump would be better off not on Twitter. I think he might want to not just say everything he does say on Twitter, but be that as it may, I think on balance, Twitter is a net positive for him. Now, with respect to the people who approve of Trump, and this is based on 38%, okay, of the people who, in this survey, who approved of Trump, they approved of Trump for a range of issues. But performance issues, the specific policies mattered a bit more to this group. Personality is important for some people. They like that he doesn't back down. They like that he's not part of the Washington establishment. But ultimately, there is a sense among his supporters that he's trying to keep his promises and he's doing the best he can. What I think is important to appreciate about the Trump presidency and how it shapes the conversation is, and this gets back to the issue I raised a moment ago about the 40% who support Trump and how he's really focusing on them. If you ask everybody what they really care about, what are the biggest problems facing the country? It's health care, it's crime, it's the size of the federal budget deficit, it's about guns and drug use, Social Security, the environment. Notice how far down our list illegal immigration is. Most people in the country as a whole are not really focused on that. But among Trump's core supporters, that is important. And Trump is doing a great deal to try to bring our number 13 on this page into alignment with number 2 on this page, crime and violence. For those of you who are from Virginia, like me, we had a governor's election this last November, and the Republican candidate for governor and the Trump White House focused on MS-13 and gang violence a great deal, talking a lot about illegal immigration, connecting it to crime to try to create an opportunity that would be favorable to Republican candidates for governor and elsewhere. Those of you who are from Virginia, I'll tell you if you're not, that didn't work so well. It didn't work so well in a lot of ways. 4 years earlier, Terry McAuliffe had been elected governor over a 4-point margin. This last election, Ralph Northam won by 9 points. Once upon a time, the Republicans had 66 of 100 seats in the House of Delegates. It wasn't that long ago. We'll call it October 2017. In January 2018, Republicans had 51 seats. And they only had 51 because they won this crazy tie process where you pick the winner's name out of a bowl. It could have been 50-50. And who knows, if people were actually voting in the right district, it might have been 51-49 the other way. Those of you in the Fredericksburg area know people were given the wrong balance. This also happened, by the way, in that district that ended up officially as a tie down in Hampton Roads. So it's not necessarily a winning hand in an election to talk about illegal immigration as much as Trump does, but it does connect them with his supporters. Just to give you another sense of how where people actually are, most people like the idea of giving permanent legal status to Dreamers, the first question here. And overall, there's not a lot of support for substantially expanding the wall along the U.S.-Mexico border. Republicans like it, Democrats really don't, and independents don't think much of it either. Now, one of the ways that we're talking about character now is late-night humor. And so this is my last slide, and we'll open it up for questions after that. This is actually my next book. I just signed a book contract this week, Late Night with Donald Trump. That's my next book. So come back for a reunion in a few years, we'll talk about that, but let me write it first. But this is the data, because this looks at jokes about presidential candidates during the campaign year, during the year they run for president. And notice how much this has become a Donald Trump moment. there is more of a conversation about Donald Trump than about any other Republican or any other Democrat going back to 1992. This is data. I'm working with a co-author at George Mason University on this project. And we see that Trump really is on to himself when we're talking about late night humor. And a lot of that late night humor is about who he is. A lot of that humor, once again, pushes us in the direction of character. We don't know a lot about what presidential candidates will do because they don't talk about issues that much. And when they do talk about issues, the reporters tend to ignore them. And then, for a growing number of people who say the news can't be trusted at all, let's just listen to some jokes, they're not going to hear anything about issues there either. It's about Donald Trump and how bizarre a person he is. It's about Hillary Clinton, how bizarre a person she is. And, you know, we can laugh, amusing ourselves to death, in the words of the great Neil Postman. The idea here is that this is not particularly useful for us as a society. I mean, even rich countries like the United States have problems. We have a deficit that is getting deeper and deeper into the red. This is a problem for the future. It's like worse with every president. We haven't balanced a budget since Bill Clinton was president. And he only did it twice. Go back before that, it was OBJ was the last one to balance a president. So, you know, when you look at the future, you think about that economic problem. We shouldn't live beyond our means. That's particularly problematic. If there's a crisis, how are we going to be able to pay for dealing with whatever might happen? But we already know we're not paying for the problems when there are crises. I mean, look at the crisis in Puerto Rico. These are Americans in Puerto Rico. Thousands of them died because they went months without electricity. Something like a third of Puerto Rico still doesn't have electricity. It is astonishing that Americans are living like this. But it's not a priority because we're laughing all the way to the bank. Well, if Puerto Rico were a state and they had senators, it'd be different too. But the real reality is that Americans have died because of government negligence in Puerto Rico. They did not respond promptly. This is what issues matter. Maybe you don't know anybody in Puerto Rico. Maybe this isn't a problem for you. Well, then we can think about the deficit. Or we can think about the average lifespan in America, which is declining. You know, for 100 years, we've seen the average lifespan in America increase. The generation born will live longer than their parents. That's not true today. In the last several years, because of increased opioid use, because of declining healthcare availability, because of increased healthcare costs, because of problems with screening, because more and more people don't have healthcare. Remember, the numbers went up during the Affordable Care Act years, but even though the Affordable Care Act is still the law of the land, the numbers have been declining ever since because of efforts to undermine it. So policies matter, issues matter, but we're not hearing about that in the news. We're not focusing on that in the news, and what we do hear about issues sometimes isn't all that accurate. It doesn't correspond to what the people care about. So, you know, I know alumni reunions are supposed to be a happy time. And so I'm hoping the rest of your time here will be more upbeat than this conversation today. But for those of you who studied political science, we are not in the upbeat business. So with that, let me turn it over to all of you for questions and comments in the time that we have left. Oh, we'll pass the microphone around so everyone can hear.
Good morning. Thank you for your time, Doctor. Communication 101 is to vet something before you publish it. Could you tell us whether his Twitter is vetted before he's sending this stuff out? Is it literally sitting on his desk and the president is responding? Is there a group that vets his Twitter communication is my question.
Yeah. They wish they could. The White House staff is really struggling with this because they want to vet his Twitter. But basically, he's not. I guess the fair way to describe Donald Trump is impulsive. You know, he has something he wants to say, and he says it. You know, and that's where he is. And it may not be in the best long-term interests of the Trump presidency to say what he's saying, but he says it anyway. I mean, think about this. You know, the Trump presidency got off on the wrong foot with respect to truth. The very first conversation about how many people showed up at his inauguration. Okay? We have pictures of the Obama inauguration. We have pictures of the Trump administration. These two pictures tell us a lot more people came to the Obama administration inauguration. Okay? So why make a big story about your crowd being bigger than Obama's crowd? That's not factually true. It is, you know, presidents don't always tell the truth. I get that. But you know what? You want to be smarter about your lies. And being smarter about your lies, as every 6-year-old knows, is to have some measure of credibility to that lie. When something is easily disproved, that's not good from the point of view of lying. But, you know, it doesn't stop there, right? Trump says that he actually won the Electoral College, but he also won the popular vote because those 3 million people who voted for Hillary Clinton were illegals. Well, we've done investigations all around the country. Nobody's finding millions of illegal votes being cast by people who are voting twice or not legally in the country or any of the rest of it. Okay. It's just not there. There's no evidence. And so there are lots of people in the White House who would love to say, let's control Trump. You know, they said let Reagan beat Reagan. They said don't let Trump beat Trump. Because it can be counterproductive to say stuff that is simply outrageous, that is simply not true. I mean, you know, a lot of people were scared when he talked about, you know, a reign of fire and fury like the world has never seen on North Korea. But if you don't like what you hear from Trump, just wait a minute, because now we're going to be friends with North Korea. We're going to have a summit with them. So that'll be, you know, that kind of erratic sort of, I feel sort of like I'm watching a pinball bounce around, and I never know where it's going to go next because, you know, sometimes we say something that is, you know, the White House says something that is really kind of tough with respect to North Korea, then it's kind of really friendly. Or, you know, we used to like the Canadians. I guess we don't anymore. You know, poor little Canada. You know, they get dumped out of NAFTA. Why? Because Trump decides it's time. So there are all these kind of inconsistencies. Now, what a presidency usually wants to do is have a kind of narrative that is consistent. Trump doesn't do that because he's impulsive. And that's part of his calculation. But that's also part of what some people like about him. He says what he thinks. He's not stage managed. He's not controlled. He's his own man. And Cole is back.
I enjoy your character analogy here. It seems to me one other thing is very important is public speaking. Of course, it started with FDR and Obama and Clinton. They were good public speakers. I think that's another very important character. What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, absolutely. It is always better when a person can be articulate in public. When they're running for office, why you want to elect them. If they're stammering and they don't have good answers, well, maybe they're not going to win. And that's a challenge, I think, for a lot of people to sort of get over that sort of natural human fear of not wanting to be in public. But politicians really do have to master that. But shyness has never been a Donald Trump trait. I don't think there's any real risk of that. But the idea of more disciplined public speaking, I think, would work to his advantage. Because he says things that are, well, again, I get back to my pinball image. He's giving a speech, and he leaves the prepared remarks behind, and he's going all over the place. You know, now he's talking about, you know, Hillary Clinton and why she should be in jail again. You know, get over it. You won the election. Hillary Clinton is not what you need to worry about as president now. But he's back to Hillary Clinton. The White House went through this whole week of saying that the firing of FBI Director James Comey was not about the Russia investigation. The Attorney General, the press secretary, they were all sort of building the narrative that Comey was fired for incompetence. And then Donald Trump goes on Lester Holt and he says, yeah, it was Russia. He's out because of Russia. No! The White House staff says, don't do this. And he does it. And we're still having this conversation because he's saying, again, Trump has been tweeting lately that the Russia investigation is bogus and it's a fraud and that Comey wasn't fired because of that. But guess what? You know, there are, what, 19 indictments now? 5 people pled guilty, something like that already. And that's faster than the convictions kicked off during Watergate, by the way, for those of you keeping score. So it's a problem to say things that are obviously not true. And it is a problem when you think about like being an effective public speaker, because you want to say things that do not involve the next day people saying that's not true. There's for those of you in the Washington area or those of you who go online, there's a great program offered by something called the Fact Checker at the Washington Post, which basically catalogs the falsities, now numbering in the thousands in terms of public statements by Donald Trump. He's the gold medal winner on the fact check questions. So this would be something that you could minimize if you had a system where what Donald Trump said was under a bit more control, a bit more caution. That would be, I think, in the Trump administration's best interest. But it's not his instincts. And, you know, Donald Trump, he's screaming at his staff all the time. I mean, one of the things that we know from the reporting is that everybody who works for Trump is leaking like crazy about how dysfunctional the White House is. The reality is that Trump says, look, I won the election, you didn't. We're doing it my way. Well, okay then. You know, that's kind of a problem if you're trying to get something through Congress. You know, here's a rule, Political Science 101. If you want people to vote with you, don't insult them. You know, that's all it is. I mean, the things that he says about the other Republicans, it's a wonder they let it slide, but they do. And they let it slide so far. But this is not effective from the point of view of getting legislation passed. So again, more control would be a really good thing. But if there's one thing I think above all that marks the Donald Trump public appearance, public speaking, is you never know what he's going to say next. And that's not in his best interest. Absolutely not. Other questions, comments? Hold for the microphone.
Oh, thank you. I had a question. Going back to one of the previous slides, it gave the disapproval and approval ratings for the presidents. There's a trend there. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, if you look closely, you'll see that we like the old presidents better. Yeah. You know, historically, if you look at George W. Bush, of course, being an outlier because of 9/11, his numbers were pretty high. But if you look at the presidents of the last 30 years, Reagan and Obama are both pretty low. Bill Clinton is somewhat lower than average. And that may be because of the growing partisanship in the country. I mean, my personal view of why we see this pattern is that we are sort of moving more and more in the public in this country into these armed camps. You know, there were people who didn't like Ronald Reagan, but they didn't hate him necessarily the way that opponents hated Barack Obama or Trump. I do think that that there is a dynamic to that has to do with growing partisanship. We have different media now, and so you can live in a bubble of people who will tell you nothing but good things about the president or nothing but bad things. And then when the White House switches parties, you get the same switch in the media. So the people who were really, really critical of Obama, really, really positive about Trump, and vice versa. So you have those kinds of dynamics going on that explains why I think we see this sort of trend towards more negative evaluations. But even with that sort of macro trend that you're mentioning, Trump still stands out, you know, in a really powerful way, even though modern presidents tend not to be treated as well. I also think, you know, that there's the fact that modern media is much more intrusive. And so we know sort of all the warts, if you will, in terms of what's going on in a White House, how policies develop, what the president is like, presidential misconduct. You know, those kinds of things are much more in the public domain than they were in the past. Now, you know, I don't know that there was much to say about Harry Truman's private life, you know, but if there was, you wouldn't have heard about it. FDR, well, we do know there was something to say about his private life, and you didn't hear about it. And same with John F. Kennedy. During his lifetime, we didn't know the rest. Now, so we've had a very different orientation. And, and in fairness to reporters, the reason that they have focused much more on character and personality and offering up a more critical position, more critical interpretation of modern politicians, is because there was a sense that there was something really, really wrong in the way that reporters had covered the 1960s. When you think about Vietnam and Watergate, when you think about all the lies of Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, the reporters, in retrospect, decided that they were too slow to hold those politicians accountable. They were too quick to believe the deceit. They were too quick to believe the lies. They were too slow to investigate. And so in the wake of Vietnam and Watergate, reporters became more aggressive. And that pattern has continued since the late 70s all the way up to the present. And with modern technology, that intrusiveness can be even more and more profound. That aggressiveness, that critical commentary can be even more and more visible and more prominent. So that's the pattern. I don't know that we're better off as a result, but that is a general pattern. But like I say, taking all those things into consideration, even so, Trump still really does have a very different dynamic than any other president on this page in terms of the country as a whole. Yeah. Hold on for the microphone.
Can you speak to the recent Medicaid expansion here? I think it just happened this week.
Right. Virginia just this week decided to expand Medicaid. This had been something, of course, that the Republicans in the majority in the House of Delegates had been opposed to for the years that Terry McAuliffe, the previous governor, had emphasized it. What changed, of course, well, there are a couple things. One, this big decline in the size of the Republican majority. You go from 2/3 to 51 out of 100. You might say, wait a minute, my seat's at risk too. And then you come up with a plan that works. I think the reason why Medicaid expansion happened in Virginia this week is because there were enough Republicans worried that they would be defeated next. There were 6 Republican senators who had districts where Ralph Northam either won or came close to winning. And so if you're a Republican senator who is in one of those districts, you've got to say, I think it's good for the party to make a deal. And if you're one of those people in the 51-seat majority in the House of Delegates, well, some of those, one was a tie, another one was decided by under 100 votes, another one was decided by under 200 votes. If people are still mad about Medicaid expansion in 2019, the Republicans might very well lose 3 House seats. I can think of 3 off the top of my head. There are more, but 3 is enough. 2 is enough. So you want to make a deal. The other thing is that when Trump became president and tried to destroy the Affordable Care Act, tried to repeal and replace it, and failed, then it's easier for Republicans to say, look, this is going to be around for a while, we might as well take the money. During the Obama years, there was always a thought that if the Affordable Care Act repeal was on the table, it would be disloyal to other Republicans to do a Medicaid expansion in Virginia. But now that Trump is president and they can't kill it, then they might just as well get that money. Because here's the deal, that 90% of the cost is covered by the feds. And that's an appealing pot of money for a lot of folks, because you're not only talking about constituents who are better off if they have health insurance versus not. Because remember, the people who are getting Medicaid expansion, these are working poor. These are not people who are unemployed. They're underemployed probably, or they don't have professional work, they can't work full-time, whatever it might be. These are people who are trying to play by the rules, okay? But they're not so well off professionally that they have jobs that have health insurance with them. So it's that coverage gap is not the totally poor, not the totally middle class or better. It's the lower middle class. And remember, if you go to a hospital and you don't have insurance, the hospital still treats you in an emergency situation. They pay the bill. The hospital has to eat it. And so that creates a lot of financial pressure, particularly in rural hospitals. And so if you think about Southwest and Southside Virginia, where the highest rates of uninsured populations are in the state, you also have the highest rates of healthcare problems. that are being treated too late, which is more expensive, or not being treated at all, which creates a crisis situation. Add those together, and you as a lawmaker might say, you know what? Not only is it good for those people to have health insurance, it's good for the hospitals in my communities that have health insurance. Okay. The other thing is, one other factor. I think that Northam is a better negotiator than Terry McAuliffe. He came out of the legislature. He'd been a state senator and then lieutenant governor. He understood and knew these Republicans and could work with them. They went fishing together. They knew each other. Everything in Virginia comes back to who goes hunting and fishing with each other. It's, in some ways, that's the real clue to, to explaining what happens around here. And as a result, Northam is able to make a deal. There's a work requirement, as you know, in the package, and that offers Republicans something that they can point to as making this more palatable. But when you saw Republicans in the House of Delegates turn towards Medicaid expansion early in the legislative session, there was almost no pushback. So there was a thought that, you know what, maybe people aren't that concerned about this. Maybe now that Obama's no longer president, now Trump's president, a Republican can support Medicaid expansion if their district is poor enough and their hospitals are financially precarious enough. Because imagine what's going to happen in a little town if a hospital closes. That's a major employer. Those are professional salaries. If you're talking about a town that has unemployment of 25% to start with, and you take away the hospital, close up shop, you're done. That's the end of that community. Who's going to buy a house there? Who can sell a house there? And you better believe that the people with training and skills aren't staying. It's a smart move. But again, are we paying for it? We'll see how this all works out. But ultimately, that's why the Republicans made the move. A whole series of factors. They say victory has 1,000 fathers. So too does the legislation to expand Medicaid in Virginia.
Dr. Farnsworth, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was an example of political science not being about the upbeat news. We have plenty more of Dr. Farnsworth for those who want to continue the conversation at 10:30, which I think is only 20 minutes from now, over in Monroe in the Political Science Department. And Dr. Farnsworth is available to continue the conversation. There's a whole lot more to talk about.
I should probably also add, there's a book signing this afternoon. That's over at the University Bookstore right after lunch. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, and thank everyone at home.
Thank you, Dr.
Sure.
All right, good morning. My name is Marshall Vogt. I'm a Mary Washington graduate of the class of 2007, and I'm proud to serve and humbled to serve on the UMW Alumni Association Board of Directors. Thank you all for coming out today. It's my pleasure to introduce this talk, which I think is going to be very awesome. I'm definitely a fan of wine, so I'm excited to hear more about it. Andrew Painter is our speaker today, and he's a 2002 Mary Washington graduate and is a zoning and land use attorney with Walsh, Colucci, Lubley, and Walsh PC. He spent much time traveling and writing about Virginia's land development and viticultural history, and he's going to share some of that with us today. He received an award from the Virginia chapter of the American Planning Association for his review of enduring rural landscapes in Fairfax County. And he's also served as an adjunct professor here, both at Mary Washington and the University of Richmond, where he taught courses in urban planning and history. He's a member of several organizations, including the University of Mary Washington Foundation Board of Directors. And Andrew holds a BA in political science from Mary Washington, a master's in urban and environmental planning from the University of Virginia, and a JD from the University of Richmond's T.C. Williams School of Law. He published his book, Virginia Wine, 4 Centuries of Change, in February of this year. And Andrew and his wife, Marianne, have 1 daughter and 2 twin boys, and they live up in the D.C. area. So I'm going to turn it over to Andrew now, and he's going to begin his talk. Thanks for coming out.
How about now? Okay, all right. It really is an honor and a privilege to be back here at Mary Washington, kind of this idyllic place that I've got so many memories. I have been a student here, as was said. I've taught students here. I see a couple of friends in the audience, including Vince Benedetto, a good friend of mine, a dear friend who, although I didn't know it at the time, that friendship would lead me down the course of being an attorney at my current place of employment as well. But being at Mary Washington, we really are a family here. And even though she's not here, she was supposed to be until our babysitter canceled on us. You know, you got 3 kids, it's a shock that the babysitter would cancel on you. But my beautiful wife, Marianne, could not be here today, but I did want to note that all of her patience, tremendous patience and support has allowed me to pursue my professional and personal goals, including writing this book about Virginia wine, and to whom the book is appropriately dedicated. I am going to be talking about the history of wine in Virginia. It's an industry that many of us have experienced firsthand. Admittedly, when I started down this journey about 10 years ago, that's when I started doing the research, I knew nothing of the wine industry in Virginia or its history. But whenever we tour a new vineyard or a winery in the Commonwealth, I think it's very important to remember how deep our viticultural roots go in the United States. Indeed, no state can claim a longer history of experimentation with wine, nor can any boast a more spectacular record of initial failure and ultimate success than can Virginia. And it really is incredible to see how we've grown from a state with almost no viticultural expertise and a state that was dominated by the tobacco and apple industries into one that is now one of the most exciting, exploding wine regions and written about regions in the world. The origins of viticulture, just to start off, back to basics, the origins of viticulture are so remote in time that nothing really certain can be known about them. Wine has aided good living since the earliest days, and the grapevine was one of the first plants to be domesticated by man. And I think it's safe to say that throughout time, wine and the vine have played important symbolic and ideological roles in funeral rites and libations in ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt as well. To those libaceous Bacchic rituals in ancient Greece, to the culture of the Greek and Roman ruling classes, even all the way up to present times to their use in Christianity, wine's use, especially with the Christian Eucharist. And it's also been medicinally recommended over time as well. And sort of the human condition being what it is, only a very small number of very primitive tribes at the very lowest economic level have failed to develop some kind of intoxicant to help them cope with the challenges of everyday life. And of those intoxicants, wine was certainly the most prevalent. It's also the least coarsening. It was the least subject to abuse. And if any of you all have chugged a bottle of wine, you know that wine has this strange power to release the human spirit from the control of the mind. And you can sort of see that in wine and art and literature and poetry. And all of this was no doubt true in the New World, where it has had a hold on Virginians since the Jamestown settlement in 1607. And the English, of course, colonized the New World for a variety of reasons. They sought to create English-speaking settlements. They wanted to find a northwest passage to Asia. They also wanted to shift their nation's trade imbalances away from hostile foreign countries. And the New World sort of captured the settlers' imagination. It was seen as this new El Dorado, a terrestrial paradise. And you just go back and you read some of the comments that some of the settlers had. They saw a colony that was replete with plentiful, naturally occurring fruits. And all of these colonists were also amazed by just these large, juicy, plump, ripe-looking native grapes in the forests surrounding Jamestown. Captain John Smith wrote, "There are vines in great abundance in many parts that climb to the tops of trees, and where they are not overshadowed by the sun, they are covered in fruit." So they have this, this impression of Virginia as this bountiful place that they could clearly grow European wine grapes. And the settlers brought with them all manner of European plants and cultivars. And they managed to practically cultivate every one of them, but they could not grow European wine grapes, known as Vitis vinifera. These are the delicate wine grapes that have been grown by the course of man over the thousands of years to create superb premium quality wine in Europe. And in Old Latin, if any of you guys recall your Latin classes, perhaps from Mary Washington, you know that Vitis vinifera means the wine bearer in Old Latin. But the most notable of the vinifera group are names that you've no doubt heard of: Chardonnay, Cabernet Sauvignon, Pinot Noir, Merlot, Cabernet Franc, etc. But what was not known then, but is known today, is that European vinifera was particularly susceptible to North America's harsher climate. It was susceptible to the fungal and bacterial diseases that Virginia offered, and also destructive pests, the most notable being Phloxera visatrix. Phloxera is a microscopic and deadly root louse that was native to Eastern America. It ravaged European vinifera vines. So these settlers that were coming here without the hindsight of scientific experimentation, they had no knowledge of this bug or why after 1 or 2 years the European vinifera grapevines would just die and wither away. And you might be asking yourself, well, what about the winemaking potential of those abundant native grapes? Surely they're just beautiful and juicy and plump. Indeed, those native grapes that grew at the tops of every tree certainly imbued a sense of the endless amount of possibilities for winemaking. There was only one problem. The native grapes produced absolutely dreadful wine. So it had this foxiness, this muskiness that you might find in your grandmother's attic, not something you really want to drink. So you start seeing, from the very start of the Virginia colony, a supreme irony. You have this irony of discovering wine grapes that could grow and look beautiful, but they produced inferior wine. And then you had the inability to grow European vinifera grapes that made quality wine. And this would form the heart of what would become Virginia's distressingly erratic viticultural narrative. Despite this problem, the colony decided to incentivize diversity in industry wherever they could. And so beginning in 1610, you start seeing the first of a series of deliberate directives being issued by the Virginia Company of London and later by the General Assembly for the promotion of wine. And what you see over time is that the content of laws relating winemaking and alcohol varies dramatically as we move through time. So, and as cultural perspectives about alcohol change. So, for example, when wine and alcohol are in favor in Virginia, such as when there are tobacco gluts and, we need to, have people endeavor in other industries, you see the colony and later the legislature encouraging viticulture. But later in the 19th century and the early 20th century, when the temperance movement flares, you see the state government enacting laws to curb the excesses of alcohol abuse. But back in 1610, during a particularly brutal winter between 1609 and 1610, which was known as the starving time, and I don't think any one of us want to live through an era called the starving time, but 3/4 of the Jamestown colonists died. Things were destitute. And the remaining colonists got in a boat. They decided to head out to the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. And they were met by Lord Delaware, who had been dispatched by the Virginia colony to reconstitute the colony. He turns them around, forces them back. We're going to make a go of it. He brings with them French vignerons, which are viticulturalists, to help grow grapes and make wine. And he also brings with him additional vinifera vines. 1612. You can see the seriousness with which the colony takes winemaking. They impose the death penalty for anybody disturbing wine grapes. In 1619, if you've been to a Virginia tasting room, Tasting experts will probably pour you wine and they'll say, well, in 1619, Act 12 made the planting of grapes compulsory. In 1620, the colony imports additional French vignerons and brings over 10,000 grapes to be imported. So you see these deliberate directives to encourage and in some ways compel the manufacturing of wine. But despite these laws, despite these efforts to encourage the cultivation of wine, all of this was hampered, not only by the pest and fungal diseases, but by real-world political issues, including in 1622, shown on the left here, a devastating Indian attack, which killed 400 of the colonists, about 1/3 of the population, killed overnight. It halted all efforts to make any type of wine. And then shown on the left, or excuse me, on the right, is tobacco. John Rolfe discovers a great strain of tobacco in Virginia in 1612, gets exported to Europe. It's just a vivacious appetite for tobacco. It gets planted everywhere in the colony. And anyone that had any sense of trying to grow grapes, forget about it. They're going to be moving towards tobacco. And I think it's been said, and I agree, that no resource has played a more significant role in the history of a state or a nation than did tobacco in young Virginia. Tobacco was used as a form of credit, but eventually you start seeing gluts on the market, you start seeing soil depletion as well. Over time, as we move away from just sort of our start and we become a crown colony, we start seeing a well-heeled aristocracy mature, which has publicly spirited, wealthy folks, particularly men, who try their hands at horticulture and winemaking on their lovely estates. Sir William Berkeley, shown on the left, turns his Green Spring estate in James City County into a veritable horticultural testing station. Robert Beverly planted grapevines in 1704 at his estate on the Mattaponi between King and Queen in Caroline counties. William Byrd II, shown on the right, experimented with viticulture at his lovely home at Westover on the James River. Some of you all might have heard of Charles Carter from Philip Carter Winery, but Charles Carter grew 1,800 vines at his estate at Cleve in King George and would later play a major role in exporting Virginia wines to Great Britain. Several of those gentlemen also supported the establishment of a chain of frontier settlement colonies to be inhabited by European folks such as the French and Germans and Swiss to act as a bulwark between hostile Native American tribes to the west and the established European settlements to the east. And these folks tried to entice these new French and German immigrants to settle in these communes by once more extolling the virtues of Virginia viticulture. And Virginia just happened to have a ready population of Frenchmen who were ready to come to Virginia. A lot of them were French Huguenots. They were French Protestants who were seeking refuge from persecution from the Catholics in France. And this led to a large-scale French emigration to America, and particularly Virginia, between 1680 and 1732. And it sparked Virginia's second major public attempt to encourage a colonial wine industry. So the idea is that we're going to settle these French out on the outskirts of civilization and force them to make silk and make wine and all the other good things that the French are good with. Two of the most famous settlements that you all might have heard of just driving around the Commonwealth, one of which is called Manikin Town. As you leave Richmond heading westward toward Charlottesville, you pass Short Pump, and one of the first exits you see is Manikin Sabot. And both of those are French names, but Manikin Town was settled in 1700. You have 400 French Huguenots being settled there on about 10,000 acres west of Richmond in what is now Goochland County. Shown on the left is a map of Manikin Town. And then some of you all may have heard just west of Fredericksburg here is the Germanna settlement. This is in 1714, settled, again, just west of Fredericksburg when several Germans found or learned of the success of Manikin Town. Ultimately, both of these settlements were abandoned, but wine was produced by these immigrants. But it does show how international events coupled with an interest in viticulture can really result in changes to the landscape and settlement of peoples. By the 1750s, again, Virginia continues to mature. You start seeing a renewed interest yet again by the colony in promoting agricultural diversification and winemaking. And the most important thing that occurs in the 1750s and 1760s, particularly in 1769, is when the legislature allocates public monies to establish a public vineyard just east of Williamsburg. The General Assembly hires employees, they hire slaves, or they buy slaves and they buy equipment. But they also hire a Frenchman named Andrew Estave who boasts that he can create 10 hogsheads of wine in 5 years. And he's no doubt encouraged by the by the incredible writings of the Frenchman that preceded him, Seeing Virginia at First Glance. He was also, unfortunately, a particularly brutal slave owner as well. But no wine is made by 1776 on the eve of the American Revolution in this public vineyard, and its equipment and slaves are sold off. When you drive east of Williamsburg, you can sort of see in the middle of tract housing that was subdivided back in the 1930s this marker. So it's pretty interesting. If you have visited a Virginia winery, then you no doubt know that the industry seems forever joined at the hip with our nation's third president, Thomas Jefferson. Tasting room guides will constantly recall the Commonwealth's connection to this man, despite him never having produced a bottle of wine. So if you leave from here today knowing nothing more, just remember he never produced a bottle of wine. But he is the 18th century's most distinguished wine connoisseur. He is the nation's foremost advocate for the development of a domestic wine industry. And he believes that wine will have a positive effect on the morals and the manners and the customs of his fellow Americans. And he believes in the promise of winemaking in the United States, and particularly in Virginia. Much of his love of wine comes from growing up in Williamsburg or in Charlottesville, but later studying at William & Mary in Williamsburg. But a major imprint on his life comes when he's appointed Special Trade Minister to France in 1784, alongside John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. And 3 years into his deployment, he ends up embarking on a 3.5-month-long circuitous route, about 1,200-mile journey through southern France and northern Italy. And ostensibly he goes because he had a cramp in his wrist, and he used that as an excuse that I'm just going to go down south, I'm going to get away from Paris, and I'm going to go to these healing springs. But he's armed with a corkscrew. This was to be the longest such journey of his life. I think a lot of us would love to go on it. And he records observations on agriculture and architecture and engineering. And he's going to keep those notes and bring them back to the United States in the hopes of sort of improving our lot here in America. But he visits the finest wine houses along the way. He learns how to select the finest wines, how to order wines, how to serve them properly as well. He also observes architectural wonders, including the Maison Carrée in Nimes, France, from which he drew inspiration for Virginia's capital at Richmond, and whose neoclassical design would subsequently set the standard for many of America's public buildings. And he would later embark on a similar journey through Holland and the Rhine Valley the following year. But in 1789, he'd be back stateside. At Monticello, he experiments with numerous plants, including grapevines, and really what was a revolutionary garden. And he would be appointed as George Washington's first Secretary of State in 1789. And from that position, he would advise not only President Washington, but 4 additional presidents about how to serve wine and how to entertain foreign heads of state. And that's very important for something in a young republic, to have protocol when you're entertaining foreign dignitaries. As president, elected in 1801, he stocks the president's home with some 20,000 bottles of wine. And by the time of his death in 1826, it can be argued that he had done more to influence the scientific and viticultural habits and knowledge of his countrymen than practically anyone else in the early republic. Jefferson's also to be credited with introducing Virginia to this man on the left, Philip Mazzei. He is an Italian farmer, he's a physician, he's a philosopher, he's a businessman, he's a diplomat, and he's a patriot. He arrives in Virginia in 1773 and is encouraged by Jefferson to settle on land immediately adjacent to Monticello that Jefferson owns in this little house, which is called Cole. And there's your highway marker. You can go out there today. It's owned by Jefferson Vineyards, and they are constantly recalling the connection of Philip Mazzei to the early Virginia wine industry. But at Cole, Mazzei, along with a couple of other Italians that he brings with him, they plant grapevines and somehow produced wine by 1776. But Mazzei's attachment to the American Revolution became his priority. He became, just really appreciated what we were doing as a country. And he later gets appointed to be a special emissary to the Duke of Tuscany on behalf of the Continental Congress. So he's definitely a patriot. The sad part in all of this is that he leaves his vineyard behind, and during the Revolutionary War, Jefferson leases out Cole to a captured Hessian general, and it was reported that that captured Hessian general's horses destroyed the entire vineyard in the course of a week. So we never know what would have happened had Mazzei and the American Revolution sort of not intervened. Our nation's first president, George Washington, shared Jefferson's belief that Virginia could one day boast a wine industry. He underwrote funds for Philip Mazzei with Jefferson. And Mount Vernon, if you've been up there in Northern Virginia, sported a vineyard enclosure at which grapes were grown. Most of us know George Washington and his love of alcohol because he operated one of the nation's first distilleries. But still, like Jefferson, he enjoyed Madeira wine, and also like Jefferson, other priorities intervened, namely trying to start a new country and prosecuting a war against Great Britain. About 11 miles south of Mount Vernon, if you've gone to Gunston Hall on Mason Neck, George Mason twice attempted to cultivate French vinifera vines, but like everybody, without success. He did underwrite a loan for a German named Maurice Pound, who came in 1759, and he arrived with vine cuttings from Germany. And there's a small riverfront town along the Occoquan, and when you're going across the Occoquan on I-95 heading northbound, you know, when you're stuck in traffic, you can sort of look off to the right or left, whichever way you're going, and there's the small riverfront town called Colchester. And the layout of the town of Colchester, this is the lots and everything, but when they laid it out, there was a wine street, and Maurice Pound's vineyard kind of formed the sort of the main nucleus of the town. Most recently, the Fairfax County Park Authority has gone about buying up land all around this old riverfront town. And they have found a couple of bottles and other winemaking equipment on those lots that were owned by Maurice Pound or operated by Maurice Pound. So definitely check that out. A lot of it is now being preserved, and there won't be any reconstruction of buildings, but I'm sure there'll be some historic markers that'll be pretty interesting. So, you know, when we look back on this colonial era, right before the American Revolution, what we see is that the enthusiasm with which Virginians had for grape cultivation did not translate into a viable wine industry. And you know, many reasons were given for this. It's the wrong type of grapes, or the wrong locations, or people just weren't sufficiently motivated enough, especially the French. The French were always being used as scapegoats. Or there were Indian attacks, and of course tobacco. But totally unknown to the colonists of the time was the role played by grapevine pests and fungal diseases, our excessive summer rainfall that led to the death and decay of those European vinifera grapevines. And the only other alternative for growing or for making wine came from the native grapes, but those proved totally inadequate. And the colonial era also saw those sporadic government attempts to try again to compel the manufacturing of wine, but those proved fruitless too. But what we do see is that Virginians keep trying. They seemed completely undeterred in their struggle to produce a commercially viable wine industry. And one Irish writer, Isaac Weld, visited Monticello in May of 1796, and he observed that several attempts have been made to bring the manufacture of wine to perfection, but none had succeeded to the wish of the parties. But we must not, however, conclude that good wine can never be manufactured upon these Virginia mountains. It will require some time, therefore, and different experiments to ascertain the particular kind of vine and the mode of cultivating it best adapted to the soil. However, once being ascertained, there is every reason to suppose that the grape may be cultivated to the greatest perfection. So he's writing this in 1796, and how prophetic that would be. And as we enter the 18th century, Virginia enters this new century as the 10th American state. It's a time when we are attempting to throw off the shackles of European imperialism in the areas of commerce and governance. And the same thing is true in the era of viticulture. We have this new emerging national pride. And during the 18th century, many viticulturalists are experimenting with native varieties and sort of this mad dash to find wine grapes that could be labeled American. And this is a race that's going on, but we're trying to identify these varieties that we could call our own. And many people focused on varietals that had developed over the course of 200 years through natural cross-pollination between European grapes and native grapes. And these are a couple of them here shown. These are called American hybrids, and they have they're purely a creation of the New World, but they combine the fruit quality and the flavor of European grapes with the disease hardiness of American grapes. And a lot of these grapes were named after the people that founded them, be it the Alexander grape or the Isabella grape, but the Catawba grape or the Concord grape or the Niagara grape shown on the right there. The most famous of all of the American hybrids to emerge during this time was a grape you all might have heard of called the Norton. This is it's the most famous of all of them. It turns out to be a Virginia grape. The origins of this grape cannot be confirmed, but it likely originated with this doctor, Dr. Daniel Norborn Norton. He is a Richmond doctor who experiments with horticulture on his Magnolia farm, which is now in the Fan area of Richmond. If any of you all have been down there and gone to the Kroger over by the Lowe's on the north side of Broad Street, this is the map of his Magnolia farm and sort of his garden sketches in the 1820s. There are several apocryphal stories and claims about how the Norton grape came to be, who discovered it, when they discovered it. But Dr. Norton is certainly to be credited with bringing this grape to public attention. He's now buried in a Churchill cemetery on the east side of Richmond. This grape was widely commercially available by the 1830s, and just prior to the Civil War, it was the most widely planted varietal in the country. And as we enter the 1850s, we grow as a nation. We're experimenting with these hybrids. Virginia is in a pretty good position. We are finding ourselves at the center of a commercial wine industry and a commercial fruit industry, with Hampton Roads being the center of all of that because of its railroad connections and shipping connections. We're shipping things all across the world, including up to New York, which is a huge wine market. But just when all seemed to be going well, yet again, fate intervenes. The industry is once again set back by devastation, this time the Civil War. It is clearly the most physically devastating war in American history and certainly in Virginia's history, which is something that was assured once Richmond was chosen as the Confederate capital. But one of the casualties of this, of course, were Virginia's vineyards. Given their physical scattering across the Commonwealth, I think it can be said with great certainty that many engagements were fought near or on Virginia's vineyards. Vineyards were destroyed, crops were ruined, grape-bearing acres fell precipitously. But here in Fredericksburg, in May of 1863, at the Second Battle of Fredericksburg, you have a battle being fought near a 300,000 native grapevine nursery, which is pretty remarkable. A couple weeks later, in June of 1863, in Fauquier County, in the northern part of Virginia, is the Battle of Upperville. You see hand-to-hand combat between 10,000 cavalry and infantry troops on an area known as Vineyard Hill, which is that square area kind of in the upper center of that picture. And then an invasion of the Confederate capital of Richmond was potentially thwarted in March of 1864, when a Union infantry column was purposely delayed at the home of Confederate Secretary of War James A. Seddon by this woman, Sarah Bruce Seddon, who entertained the Union column's colonel over a bottle of blackberry wine that she procured from their cellar. And she dispatched a servant secretly to go and warn the Confederate government in Richmond that the Union troops were on the way. And later it was mused that the Confederate capital may have been saved, albeit briefly, over a bottle of Virginia wine. Despite the setbacks of the American Civil War, Virginia viticulture bounces back rapidly. Following Appomattox and the cessation of hostilities, we start seeing the immigration of Northerners to the Commonwealth of Virginia, who bring with them new farming techniques, and they sort of help modernize Virginia's agricultural practices. You also see an influx of Germans during this point in time who bring with them knowledge of the viticultural process. And all of this contributes by the 1870s to what can be legitimately labeled Virginia's first real wine industry. This is a wine industry that is founded around native and American hybrid varieties like the Norton and the Ives and the Concord and the Delaware. Most of the vineyards are located in the Piedmont area of the Commonwealth, between Prince William County and Warren County and Albemarle County. In Prince William County, if any of you all are from up there, or Manassas, you can take pride in knowing that several German families settled in the Haymarket area and Manassas area. Franz Peters and the Mill Park Wine Company, this is a wine company that operates between 1869 or 1870 or so and the early 1900s. But these are some of the labels that come from that. In Warren County, Marcus Buck operates his Belmont Vineyards, which has now been incorporated into Shenandoah National Park. And there's a professor at James Madison University that recently was able to use students and sort of some physiographic satellite imagery to locate that vineyard, which of course is now 70, 80 years into a park, is completely overgrown. But she's done some fascinating research as far as trying to find out where the old wine cellars were and things like that. But it is in Albemarle County that Virginia's first wine industry really takes off. The county is known as the capital of the Virginia wine belt. The county boasts a monthly publication shown here on the left dedicated to winemaking and grape growing. There's an association that pops up known as the Monticello Grape and Fruit Growers Association. You also have a series of families that settle on the Rivanna River on the north side of town. Perhaps one of the most famous things that comes out is the Monticello Wine Company. This is founded in 1873 by German immigrants and families of German descent. They make wine from the Delaware and Norton grape and the Catawba grapes and the Ives grape. They won international awards. This is shown up in the winery. They built a 3-story winery in downtown Charlottesville. There is a wine street in Charlottesville, which is where this which is where this historic marker is there. And you can go there, and near the historic marker, you can still see the last remaining structure from the Monticello Wine Company, which is the manager's house, which is pretty neat as well. But they win international awards. It's hard to believe, but they did. They won an international award for their Norton Claret wine in Vienna in 1876 and in Paris in 1878. And they put those awards that they proudly won on all of their labels. Their wines were sold in New York as well, so it's pretty amazing. And so, by 1890, we've got a wine industry that is reaching new heights. The state is ranked 5th overall nationally in terms of grape production and 7th in the nation in cultivation. But yet again, once more, within a decade, 10 years, the appearance of these structural and physical impediments once again intervene, and there's a rapid decline and near collapse. Part of it was economics. There was a long depression nationally between 1873 and 1896. You've got the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869, which just floods eastern markets with West Coast grapes. You've got disorganization. There's no statewide plan. There's no champion. There's no advocacy group advocating on behalf of Virginia wine as an industry. There's fungal diseases. There's brought on by excessive summer rainfall between 1886 and 1890, such as black rot and downy mildew. And then you have politics. Politics intervenes, and particularly the temperance movement, and the democratically controlled General Assembly could not resist it. You've got temperance movements flaring, and you have the enactment in 1886 of something called the Local Option Act. And that Local Option Act left it up to each town and city and county to decide for themselves whether or not they wanted to ban alcohol. And the first in the Commonwealth to ban alcohol is Albemarle County, which is pretty remarkable in 1886. And as a result, by 1900, the amount of gallons we're producing drops from 461,000 gallons in 1890 to 38,000 gallons 10 years later. Virginia starts its emergence to becoming a one-fruit state between 1872 and 1920 in what's called the winter apple period. You can see those apples in Nelson County and Albemarle County and Frederick County around Winchester, which becomes the apple capital of the world. But not all is necessarily bad. Right at the time that all of this is occurring, we see Paul Garrett emerge. Paul Garrett is a North Carolinian who founds a company called Garrett & Company in North Carolina in 1890. He produces a wine known as Virginia Dare wine. Some of you all may have heard of Virginia Dare wine. But it's a sweet Scuppernong blend, and he is a proud North Carolinian, proud American. He wraps all of his marketing in patriotic imagery, and he wants Scuppernong, as delightful of a name of a grape as that sounds, to become the quintessential American grape. He wants to export it across the country, and he nearly succeeds in doing so. So you might be asking, well, what does this North Carolinian have to do with Virginia wine? Well, when North Carolina enacts its statewide prohibition law in 1903, he decamps and relocates to Norfolk. And in Norfolk, he constructs a 200,000 square foot, and that's equivalent to 2 Walmarts, by the way, 200,000 square foot winery. The winery up top, you can see Garrett & Company, and a 2-story, 25-foot in height clock that you can see all across Hampton Roads. Pretty remarkable. And he would later move again to New York following Virginia's 1916 enactment of Prohibition. During Prohibition, he again becomes this masterful marketer. He is the first, he doesn't sell off many of his winery plants or anything like that, but he's the first to emerge right after Prohibition, ready to satisfy America's appetite for wine. He's ready to go. And he is remembered today as the Dean of American Winemakers. Here's some of his marketing. Virginia Dare, of course, if you know your history of the Roanoke colony, this is the first European child reported to be born in the New World. Following the strange disappearance of all the settlers, nobody knows what happened to Virginia Dare, but it didn't matter for Paul Garrett. Paul Garrett made up a variety of tales, and I brought a book with me too that he published called The White Doe, or The True Story of Virginia Dare. All of his marketing, it's just, it's complete false, but all of this marketing shows, what she would have looked like in her teens and early 20s, and here she is running off with her beau at the time. Nobody knew what this woman looked like, or even if she ever survived, but it didn't matter. Americans bought it up. It's pretty remarkable. So that all brings us to Prohibition, everyone's favorite topic. It had a catastrophic effect on the Virginia wine industry, and frankly, the wine industry nationwide. It served as the last nail in the coffin for Virginia's wine industry, which by the time of its enactment here was completely moribund. One thing to remember also about today's lecture, wine had historically been promoted as a staple food, something that is similar to olive oil and bread. It's not just for ceremony. It's an agricultural product. It's a staple food at the table, and I think it should be remembered as so, and I'm just editorializing it. It had also been seen as a temperance beverage. Writing in 1818, Jefferson said, "No nation is drunken where wine is cheap, and none sober where the dearness of wine substitutes ardent spirits as the common beverage. In truth, wine is the only antidote to the bane of whiskey." But beginning in the 1880s, as we have seen, Virginia's social and political fabric starts heading down a path which will forever treat wine as a purely alcoholic beverage with no redeeming qualities. You have the emergence of groups like the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League, which start advocating for, they start appearing outside of barkeepers and saloons asking, and just praying that they shut down. There are a variety of political cartoons showing these drunken fathers who waste all of the money on alcohol, and they come home and they beat their wives and they just completely neglect their children. And eventually, all of this sentiment leads to the enactment of statewide prohibition, which becomes effective in Virginia in 1916. I like this map because it shows in 1909 just which counties and which cities are wet, which ones are dry. It's pretty interesting. But Virginia does eventually enact statewide prohibition, and it becomes effective in 1916. This prohibitionist movement is bolstered a couple of years later when the 18th Amendment is sent to the states for ratification. And you have the National Prohibition Act, which is commonly referred to as the Volstead Act, which many of you all might recall. But that has a starting date of January 1920. And there's a variety of loopholes, but it's important to, sufficient for this to just note that the Volstead Act prohibited the manufacturing and sale of any intoxicating beverage, including wine. That's scary, scary thoughts for all of us that like wine. And this is a law that's going to be in effect for the next 13 years, 18th Amendment, Volstead Act. But one thing that's interesting, laws cannot change folkways, and our nation's experience with prohibition certainly attests to the truth of that adage. Prohibition proved to be a colossal failure. It just did. It wrought devastation also on the nation's wine industry, and lawlessness is prohibition's longest lasting legacies, with evils and excesses surpassing even those of the pre-prohibition era. America's wine culture went into steep decline during this time because everyone started moving to sort of these underground winemakers that encourage cheap, sugary, fortified wines, and it solidified the notion that wine was a purely alcoholic product rather than an agricultural product. It also halted all research in viticulture, and it diminished, and this is very important to understand, it diminished America's taste for drier and less alcoholic wines. But by 1932, with the Great Depression in swing, both national political parties abandoned prohibition on their political platforms. The 21st Amendment is ratified by the states in 1933, which had two parts, the first of which was to simply repeal the 18th Amendment. So it's interesting that there's only one subject that appears twice in our Constitution and in our amendments, and that's alcohol. So I think it's pretty neat. So it repeals the 18th Amendment. But after repeal, it wasn't as though everything went back to normal. The state and federal governments were absolutely determined to eliminate the excesses of prohibition and to achieve an orderly liquor market through what they called a liquor control system. And the legal justification for this is found in the second clause of the 21st Amendment, which most of us overlook, namely that it left it to each state to determine whether they would legalize alcohol, whether they ban it, restrict their production, consumption, or access to it. And this results in a profusion of alcohol control laws all across the nation, with each state serving as their sort of micro-laboratory. And in Virginia, our liquor control program was adopted by the General Assembly. It's actually modeled on a system out of Quebec, amazingly enough. But it had three parts, and it goes into effect in 1933. The first of which is that the Department of Prohibition now becomes the Department of Alcohol Beverage Control. The second thing, and that's where you get your ABC stores, right? And you go into the ABC stores, and this comes to the second part, we adopt a hybrid monopoly and state licensure system wherein beer and wine, kind of the softer spirits, will be sold at a select number of state licensees, while all the hard liquor would be sold exclusively by the state in a monopolistic fashion. The first store opens in Richmond in 1934, the second one in Hampton Roads that year as well. And then the most important thing to remember from this is the three-tiered regulatory system. Before we get to the three-tiered regulatory system, here's an image of the first ABC store opening in Norfolk in 1934. And you know, you go to the ABC stores today and you can browse, you can take the little shopping cart and go around, but that's not the way it was in the 1940s and 1930s. This is what the ABC stores looked like. It was a counter. They had a list of all the alcoholic beverages and you would select it. And then these men, which probably never smiled, would go to the back and bring you the liquor. But what of the three-tiered regulatory system? Well, this is a system that you have beverage manufacturers, including breweries and distilleries and wineries. They can't sell directly to consumers. They have to sell to distributors. And the distributors then sell to the retailers and restaurants. Everybody's getting a kickback. Everyone's supposed to sign off on forms. But basically it means that if you're a winery, you have to go through a distributor as a middleman. And so no consumer can actually go to the producer and procure their desired beverage. And we'll see how that changes. But the bottom line is, as we move away from prohibition and its limiting effects, the state's liquor control system is clearly, those effects are clearly self-evident. By the late 1960s, we have almost no quality wine industry. We have only 6 licensed wineries. We have 16 acres of grapevines being planted, none of which are vinifera European varieties, nearly all of which are table grapes that are unsuitable for production. And what wine we did produce by the mid to late 1960s is lower shelf, sweet, less reputable, bum wines, I would say, highly fortified with alcohol. And they were produced from several small operations. But this is pretty much the extent of Virginia wine. It's produced in Danville and Richmond and Petersburg, Richard Wild's Irish Rose, which is still being manufactured, amazingly enough. Now, one exception to this was Woburn Winery, which is down in Mecklenburg County near the North Carolina line. It's founded in 1940 by a veteran of World War I, a guy named John June Lewis. And what's amazing about this is that not only was it the only winery by the late 1960s to be producing wine made purely from Virginia grapes, but it was also the first winery in the country to be owned by an African American. And I've had the honor of going down there. I took these photos, and this is the winery building. And John June Lewis has passed away several decades over, but his son, who's now in his 80s, Ducky Lewis, gave me a tour. If you zoom in, you can see Woburn Winery, Bonded Winery number 16. But it's interesting going out there because there are several buildings and dependencies and old slave quarters all just sitting there. And in the middle of it is this winery. And here's a picture of John June Lewis as well. And I also, Ducky also gave me a couple of the wine labels, which I liked. This wine was sold to Southern Railway passengers as well. So it's pretty darn remarkable. But in the late 1960s, the bottom line is most observers would have thought that Virginia's wine industry was just as non-existent as it had been when we entered Jamestown. And if the state was ever to revive its wine industry, it would require tremendous dedication and foresight. And say what you will about Virginia wine, but since the 1960s, we have established a quality wine culture from scratch in just 2 generations. The wine industry's vision and achievements since the 1960s are nothing short of remarkable. And one of the first starts comes in 1967 when a retired airline pilot or Air Force pilot, Chuck Rainey, and his wife, appropriately named Virginia, decides to plant 110 French hybrid vines in an old peach orchard here in Virginia, in the Amosville area of Rappahannock County. And the following year, they plant an additional 1,400 French hybrid and vinifera vines. But what makes the Raineys planting a little bit different is that they have the intention of opening up a small artisanal winery, which they later do, and it's called Farfalou Vineyards. And if you know French or some old French, Farfalou means crazy and eccentric. But this initial Farfalou planting here, and unfortunately it's since closed, but this initial Farfalou planting really served as the much needed catalyst for the rebirth of our modern wine industry. And as it turns out, their sort of crazy Farfalou planting wasn't so crazy after all, because one by one in the aftermath of Farfalou's great gamble, you start seeing the emergence of all of these enterprising individuals that are hoping to plant and cultivate Virginia's very first significant French, American, and vinifera vines. Of course, much of this fine wine rebirth has to come from an army of dedicated grape growers, and many of them believe that Virginia's latter-day wine renaissance should be formed around European vinifera. And to set Virginia's wine industry up for maximum long-term success, vinifera is the key. And many of these true believers came together in the Plains, Virginia, under the creaking floors and ceilings of the old historic Trinity Church in October of 1973 to form the Vinifera Wine Growers Association. They were led by a highly dedicated but opinionated leader, a gentleman right here, Treville Lawrence, who believed and once told a journalist famously, like, he said, all other varietals other than vinifera are hamburger wines and should be discouraged. But this Vinifera Wine Growers Association, they disseminate literature. They provide technical information to would-be growers. They provide classes. They sponsor educational courses, and they found a periodical that's published quarterly called the Vinifera Wine Growers Journal. But very importantly, they fought opposition from the U.S. Department of Agriculture and Virginia Tech, both of which thought that the planting of vinifera was impossible and should absolutely be discouraged. And this is important to understand. There was no public sector support for growing vinifera on the East Coast when these guys got started in the 1970s. And as Barboursville's first winemaker, Gabriele Rousey, said, it was a very cold landscape for would-be winemakers, and everyone discouraged it. It was like telling someone that you could grow bananas in Alaska. It just couldn't be done. But the most important thing that the industry did, and the thing that I think has led to the industry's continued success, was that they encouraged the rebirth of state support for winemaking, something that hadn't occurred since the colonial period. And the association secured a choice meeting with Governor Mills Godwin in 1976, in December of 76, along with his Commissioner of Agriculture and Consumer Services, a guy named Mason Carbaugh, and who actually still lives in Hanover. And I had the good fortune when I was writing the book to interview him about this, and he gave me these wonderful handwritten notes about his recollections into the early industry, and I have those, a very sort of cherished memento. But all of these discussions led to a variety of promotional events in the late 1970s, and they were soon bolstered by a major legislative act in 1980 known as the Farm Winery Act. As we just discussed, you might recall, we have the three-tiered distribution system. By the 1970s and going into the 80s, this was an archaic system. It was not. It was costly to winemakers. It made it very difficult for grape growers to grow wine, especially because you had to go through distributors. And distributors are, they're looking out for California, frankly. They're not looking for small artisanal wineries here in the Commonwealth. But this act, this 1980 Farm Winery Act, rewrote all of Virginia's wine laws and was the most important structural improvement to the industry. It started changing back the perception of winemaking and viticulture as an ancient art, as an agricultural product that really should be encouraged and not just be relegated to the back of a low shelf at the back of the ABC store. What the Farm Winery did is it created two categories of wineries, one of which was called a farm winery. And to classify as a farm winery, you needed to get you needed to have a minimum of 51% of your fruit, your juice that was going into the wine, had to be grown on land that you owned or leased somewhere in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And no more than 25% of your juice or fruit that was going into a single bottle of wine could come from outside of the Commonwealth. Most notably, and as shown here, the wine law allowed those who held that farm winery license to completely bypass the three-tier distribution system. Bypass the distributors, sell directly to consumers. You have a certain number of licenses that you can have for off-site plant or off-site consumption as well. But call it what you will, whether it's in-state favoritism or prudent opportunism. But this Wine Act allowed winery owners to act as their own wholesalers and distributors to grocery stores and restaurants and consumers. And within 2 years, the number of farm wineries that we had in Virginia completely boomed. The Commonwealth also, a couple years later, decided to fund 3 new taxpayer positions. These are, I have to underscore this again, these are taxpayer-funded positions to encourage the making and promotion of alcohol in a southern Christian state whose agriculture industries are dominated by apples and tobacco. But this signaled the single most potent support, I think, of any southern state towards the stimulation of a quality wine industry. It provided for a state enologist and a state viticulturalist to be based at Virginia Tech. Bruce Zachlin, who is professor emeritus at Virginia Tech. He was down at Virginia Tech for many years, and he still is. He's our state enologist who handles the chemistry and the quality of wine grapes. State viticulturalist Tony Wolfe, who's up just outside of Front Royal and near Paris, Virginia, experiments with growing grapes in the vineyard. These are taxpayer-funded positions. The General Assembly also funded a full-time wine marketing specialist to be based at a new wine marketing office in Richmond. And Leanne Layden, who has written several books about the Virginia State Fair and Secretariat, is shown here. And you can see how far we've come, because that was the extent of our promotional effort. And you can see how excited Leanne is in that picture. I also have this picture up here, VDAC's Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services Commissioner Mason Carbaugh, who, along with Governor Godwin and Governor Dalton and Robb and Beliles, he would stay as commissioner throughout the 1970s and 1980s. And he's shown here talking with Leon Adams, who wrote this book in 1973 called The Wines of America. It was the first book to talk about what we're doing in America. And obviously the majority of this is California wine. But he was persuaded by a person we'll see in a second to cover Virginia wine, and he talked about Woburn Winery in this. But this was the first time that Virginia wine had gotten any notoriety from a publication as well. Alongside these three positions, we have the creation of something known as the Wine Growers Advisory Board and a productivity fund, which is to be used for funding research and sort of plowing those excise taxes back into research and promoting wine in Virginia. And then you also start seeing in 1985 the phrase Virginia wine country being used as a label by the state. I mean, now we have a wine country, you know. We might have like 12 vineyards, but it's a wine country, you know. And then we also have gubernatorial support from our governor. Governor Dalton, of course, shown on the left here, presenting an award to Archie Smith at the Boar's Head Inn. He signed the Farm Winery Act into law. Here's Governor Chuck Robb proclaiming the very first Farm Winery Week in 1983 with a bunch of vineyardists and winemakers as well. But it really is Governor Gerald Beliles, who serves as governor between 1986 and 1990, who takes up the mantle to support the wine industry in Virginia. He declares Farm Winery Month in 1986, which is later converted to a Wine Month in 1988. And Virginia governors ever since have proclaimed October as Wine Month, and it remains the state government's most significant period for industry marketing. But Governor Beliles also hosted receptions at which he provided Virginia wines to business owners and other governors and people out of state. And then most significantly, he embarked on a 3-day, kind of channeling Jefferson, embarked on a 3-day, 11-stop tour of Virginia wineries. And you think about all the things that governors have to deal with. He's putting his money where his mouth is, and he is making wine promotion a priority in Virginia. But he goes on this 3-day, 11-stop tour in 1988, which is unprecedented for any American governor before or since. He also has a variety of promotional campaigns as well. Those grape cluster directional signs that you see ubiquitous along Virginia's highways come out of his administration. If you go down to downtown Roanoke, Eli's Provisions, used to be known as Sundat Farm Market, but Eli's Provisions has the largest collection, in fact, I've seen the only collection of these wine shelves, Virginia wines, a growing tradition. All of these marketing initiatives, which I think are pretty cool and pretty neat. New posters take off as well, again, hearkening back to the roots of Virginia as sort of the first in the country to really experiment. And again, Virginia wines, one taste and you'll know why. And I would say, too, Governor Beliles was very instrumental in hooking me up with the University of Virginia Press and George Mason University Press for this. He's a very good friend and, again, second to none in promoting of Virginia. During this rebirth period, you have these enterprising individuals who really are the vanguard generation of Virginia's wine growers. Most of the people back then had no knowledge of the viticultural process. They had no prior experience in growing grapes. Most of them were holding full-time positions. They were just sort of looking to diversify their income. And a lot of this, we're at Mary Washington, a lot of this is led by women, a lot of widows that are interested in diversifying the products that they produce on their large landed estates, a lot of them outside of Middleburg in Fauquier and Loudoun counties. Archie Smith, shown here up top on the left and then in the straw hat, he plants 6,000 vines on a 5-acre vineyard outside of Middleburg in 1972 at Meredith. And this grows to be the largest vineyard and winery in Virginia throughout the 1990s, but it's now defunct. Shown here is his son, Archie Smith III, who's an Oxford-trained guy. He comes back to Virginia, becomes one of the most famous winemakers. And then Annette Boyd, who follows Leanne Layden as being our wine marketing specialist. And it's a position she's held pretty much off and on ever since. And she's still down at our wine marketing office. But there they are, here he is talking to Governor Beliles, and there they are having a great time on Governor Beliles' limousine during that 3-day tour, which I think is pretty neat. Elizabeth Furness, also outside of Middleburg. She's an accomplished horsewoman who turns her dairy farm into Piedmont vineyards. And one of the stories I chuckle about is that Miss Furness sold 7 bottles of her Piedmont wine to a DC wine shop. She just drove across the Potomac, sold the bottles, and immediately purchased them back. And for this, she was given a commendation by Governor Dalton as being the first Virginia vintner to sell Virginia wine outside of the Commonwealth. So we're really kind of, hand to mouth, building block stage here. Lucy Morton, shown on the left here, she's a self-proclaimed grape nerd who happens to be the sister of Mary Washington Historic Preservation Professor Emeritus Brown Morton. And she grows up with him on their family estate at Moreland in King George County, just east of town here. And she starts teaching viticultural classes and becomes one of the foremost viticultural consultants, not just in Virginia, but on the East Coast. She's consulted for multiple people. Doug Flemmer turns his plantation nursery at Ingleside into Ingleside Plantation Vineyards. He hires a gentleman, a Belgian named Jacques Recht, who stays with him for nearly 2 decades as a viticultural consultant. If you've ever been to Nelson County and know Al and Emily Weed, they opened up Mountain Cove. James and Emma Randall opened up Shenandoah Vineyards as well in the Shenandoah Valley. So things are occurring all across the Commonwealth. Dennis and Sharon Horton, this is a couple that has probably done more experimenting with grape varieties than any other. And they reintroduced the Norton grape to commercial production in the Commonwealth of Virginia in 1993. And the following year introduced Viognier, a little-known obscure Rhone Valley grape. But their 1994 Viognier is one of the most sought after and written about vintages in the country, which is pretty remarkable. Felicia Rogan, another supporter of the book, she would call me up probably every 3 days or so and just say, Andrew, what's the status of the book? I'm 90 years old. I want to have this before I die. And she was a force to be reckoned with. But she was the founder of Oakencroft Vineyards, which is also now defunct. It's now an artisanal juice factory, which is really nice. They produce some good stuff. But she and her husband John founded the Boar's Head Inn outside of Charlottesville. But the idea for opening Oakencroft came in 1979 after taking classes from Lucy Morton. And so the two of them planted their grapes at Oakencroft, and she helped found an organization called the Jeffersonian Wine Grape Growers Society. She also helped found the Albemarle Harvest Wine Festival, the first one, of course, occurring in 1981, and it's still going strong. But Felicia is remembered today appropriately as the matriarch of the Virginia wine industry. And I think it's important to recall that visiting a winery back in the day was not like visiting a winery today. And oftentimes it wasn't just like visiting someone's home, it was somebody's home. You had basements, kitchens, living rooms, converted garages, all serving as wine tasting rooms. And visitors were often encouraged to call ahead to make sure the winemaking families were even in town. Fewer of the wineries charged fees, though, which is something that's certainly gone by the wayside. And it can be hard to find those types of places today, but they can still be found. And one that I might commend to you is Zephaniah Farm Vineyard. It's just outside of Leesburg in Loudoun County, and it's owned by the Hatch family. And this is a family that manages the vineyard. The family makes the wine. The family operates the tasting room and their living room as well. And a family council determines all of the blends. And it's a very, very small, proudly small winery. But shown there is the house, and on the right is the actual tasting room. And there's Bonnie Archer, who's the wife in the family, and she operates the tasting room and kind of oversees it. Alongside the growing chorus of Virginia's revolutionary winemakers were foreign wine investors. By the 1970s, many of Europe's great wine houses were looking to have an American presence. Most of them naturally purchased land in California, but this trend was not lost on the Commonwealth of Virginia either. Gianni Zonin in 1976, he had Italy's largest wine house. He is looking for a midway point in 1976 between Europe and California, and he eventually purchases a 700-acre sheep farm in the Barbersville area of Orange County, which features the original Barber house, the house that Thomas Jefferson designed for Governor James Barber, which had burned down, and the ruins are there, which he's captivated by history. There are several other buildings as well, and he decides to open up Barbersville Winery and vineyards. And this Barbersville planting by this Italian company on this 700-acre farm is the largest planting of vinifera east of California. Today, it boasts a world-class restaurant. If any of you all have not been there, you should. It boasts a sort of bed and breakfast and small hotels, but it is a true quality destination. Zonin brings with him a winemaker, Gabriele Rousey, and here's Gianni Zonin on the left and Gabriele Rousey on the right, and there's Gabby with his vines as well. But he brings with him Gabriele Rousey from Italy, who arrives in 1980, who would leave Barboursville in 1980, but would become a force of his own in the Virginia wine industry. He later serves as a winemaker and a consultant for multiple wineries, and is kind of remembered today as the godfather of the Virginia wine industry. And then he'd be later replaced by a winemaker named Luca Peschina, who remains winemaker there today. The Italian investment in Barboursville was followed 2 years later by another Orange County entrepreneurial endeavor, this time led by a German doctor, Gerhard Guth, who arrives wanting to plant a major planting in northern Orange County. And he wants to plant Gewürztraminer and Chardonnay and Riesling, some German grapes as well. And then Prince Michel, if any of you all have headed down Lee Highway towards Charlottesville, Frenchman Jean Leduc founds Prince Michel in 1983, and a year later has 100,000 European vinifera vines growing in 90 acres, and grows to be Virginia's largest winemaking enterprise by the mid-1990s. Williamsburg Winery comes in 1986 when a Belgian, Patrick Duffler, purchases a 200-acre Wessex 100 farm outside of Williamsburg, and today features a winery and a restaurant and hotel, again, a world-class destination for sure. This growing industry also spurs a soft economy of, sort of a cottage industry of centered around marketing and promotion of wine. You have the Virginia Wine of the Month Club being founded here in Fredericksburg in the mid-1980s. You have hot air balloon rides that go over beautiful vineyards in central Virginia. You have wine stores that start carrying Virginia wine. You also have the emergence of Virginia Tech evolving from being a staunch opponent to growing vinifera to being one of the largest and most foremost research institutions on the East Coast, kind of the UC Davis of the East. It's really remarkable, the turn of events. You also have historic trust properties like Mount Vernon and Gunston Hall and Montpelier that start seeing wine as a way to get more people in the door to experience history. Monticello does more than any other. They restored Jefferson's quarter-acre Northeast Vineyard in 1985. They reestablished the 16,000 square foot Southwest Vineyard in 1993. They recreate the wine cellar in 2010. And then you also have the emergence of wine festivals that help to promote Virginia wine. These festivals provide critical exposure and financial rewards to the state's wineries. It allows people to experience them firsthand, to talk to the winemakers. And many of these early festivals, it's kind of funny, feature tractor exhibits alongside grape stomping contests and wagon rides and live music. It's pretty neat. And you also start seeing the emergence of professionally judged competition, the most notable being the Virginia Governor's Cup, which takes place at the Red Fox Inn in Middleburg in 1982. So when we look back on this rebirth era, between 1976 and say 1990 or so, Virginia had grown from virtually nothing in 1967 to the most promising wine-growing state in the Southeast by the 1990s. Growth in the state's industry was dramatic and remarkable. We grew from 6 licensed wineries in 1976 to 43 by 1991. We had managed to develop those cottage industries centered around quality wine grapes, most of which is French hybrids and vinifera. But we have modern technology. We've got chemical sprays. We have a lot of public sector support as well that from Virginia that increasingly recognizes that the money spent in researching and promoting viticulture can pay significant dividends to the Commonwealth's economy. And you think back to where we came from. Such potential had been nearly unimaginable 2 decades earlier, but now all it took was to spend a weekend in what is now known as Virginia wine country to change the perception of even the most hardened disbeliever. And it truly seemed that at long last, the Old Dominion was waking up to the viticultural promise that was Thomas Jefferson's dream. And so we come to today. After the 1990s, especially after the dawn of the new millennium, the wine industry went into overdrive. Today, the Commonwealth's position as a quality winemaking state has arrived, and while the industry is still in its infancy, its growth has proven steady and strong. We have aggressive public sector marketing and financial assistance that has enhanced the reputation for our wines, and it really has been Virginia's comprehensive approach to wines. It's not just the quality of wines, it's our history, it's our beautiful scenery, it's the fact that we've got an emerging sort of locavore, farm-to-table market economy within driving distance, all of which are complementary. And Virginia offers now a wealth of wine tourism experiences, attracting wine enthusiasts and connoisseurs from across the world. Just beautiful wineries. This is Stone Tower outside of Leesburg, but just incredible. Alongside all this, our wine marketing specialists have connected with those who write about wine and influence our drinking habits. We've lobbied Virginia wine critics like Oz Clarke and Stephen Spurrier to come to Virginia, experience our wines, and go home to write about them. And our state is now consistently recognized in publications like Wine Spectator and Wine Advocate and the Savor magazine and New York Times as being one of the nation's most promising wine regions. And in 2012, the Commonwealth was honored when wine enthusiasts named Virginia one of the world's top 10 best wine travel destinations. I mean, just incredible how far we've come. The wine industry today, after many fits and starts, is now a valued component of the state's economy. We have nearly 300 wineries in all corners of the Commonwealth. We've got craft breweries, we've got cideries, we've got craft distilleries. We are now wetter as a state than at any time prior to Prohibition, which is good. Our industry employs, or I say our, I'm not a part of the industry, but the wine industry employs 8,000 employees. That's up significantly from just a couple years ago. It creates or contributes $1.37 billion to Virginia's economy each year. That is up from $750 million 2 years ago, which is significant. Wine is now made in 64 of Virginia's 95 counties in all corners, and we are now tied for 5th with Texas, amazingly enough, for wine grape production behind California, Oregon, Washington, and New York. We have over 60 different grape varieties being planted here. There are 10 winemaking regions, 28 wine trails, 7 American viticultural areas, and those American viticultural areas are designated areas of grape-growing regions that are defined by geographic features that influence the wines that they produce. We have winemakers from outside of Virginia who have been attracted to the Commonwealth, and these winemakers are true artists that are expressing their agricultural craft. But each region, each vintage is a reflection of our state's climate. Each bottle tells a different story, which is pretty remarkable. We've also had continued strong public sector support. Governor Mark Warner operated his own vineyard and produced his own private bottles called Rappahannock Bend. But it's really Governor Bob McDonnell and his wife Maureen, and despite their legal troubles a few years ago, they did a lot more than practically any other Virginia governor since Belisle's to promote Virginia wine. They were led by a very able Secretary of Agriculture, former Commissioner of Agriculture and Consumer Services, a guy named Todd Haymore, who's shown here on the right with Governor McDonnell, and there he is on the, or shown on the left with Governor McDonnell, and there he is on the left. But Governor McDonnell also, that administration unveiled these large wine region signs. So you've got, again, publicly funded signs on the VDOT right-of-way advocating the consumption of alcohol. It's really quite remarkable when you think about it. We also have stars that have come to Virginia, be it Dave Matthews or President Trump or Steve and Gene Case, Steve Case being the founder of AOL, or John Kent Cook, the former minority owner of the Washington Redskins. They are all operating vineyards here as well. Loudoun County, with its proximity to Washington, D.C., its purchasing power, and the fact that people just want to break out of D.C. and head west on a given Saturday or Sunday, has more wineries than any other in Virginia. They have coined and trademarked the phrase D.C.'s wine country for all of their promotional events. It's pretty remarkable, and this is in downtown Purcellville. You've got the here's Piedmont, Virginia community college students experimenting with grapevines. Practically every community college in Virginia offers some sort of wine appreciation, vineyard management certificate program, or at least a class, which is pretty remarkable. PVCC has done a lot more here. Wineries are all across the Commonwealth. Jim Law at Linden Vineyards, who's kind of a sage of quality wine. Chateau Morissette, which also has a restaurant adjacent to it down in Floyd County along the Blue Ridge Parkway. Our wine festivals have grown. It's not uncommon to see 10,000 people in a given weekend at a particular wine festival. If you've been down to Norfolk to the Town Point Virginia Wine Festival, that's one of the oldest and longest lasting ones. It's pretty remarkable how far that's come. And again, our historic trust properties are inviting all sorts of people to come and experience history. And it really is, again, that comprehensive approach that sets Virginia aside from other states. And we are very, very fortunate to have that here. The home builders. have even got on board with promoting. This is in Fairfax County, adjacent to Bull Run Winery on the Fairfax-Prince William line. But you've got Stonebridge at Bull Run Winery. So it's amazing how far we've come when you've got the home building industry getting behind it for promotional events too. It's pretty remarkable. And you know, alongside all this good news, it is easy to overlook sort of the myriad challenges that this industry faces. It has to be recalled that this is an industry that, like the industry in the 19th century, is nearly 30 years, it's only 30 years old. There have been many concerns that our impressive pace of growth, the speed with which we've been opening wineries and doing all sorts of things, that it's going to peter out eventually. We have been facing issues that are faced by more experienced wine regions, but without their experience, frankly. There is the need, for example, to increase the sheer amount of fruit, quality fruit juice that goes into our wines. That's pretty big. We also need to find a much better way to sort of market to in-state residents. We got to find a way to reduce the price of Virginia wine. We have to continue to participate in the digital marketplace and be competitive there. And then also there's a concern from those that live around wineries that there's sort of an over-reliance on events. Several of these wineries, frankly, are wedding factories. They're not focusing on the quality of wine. Wine is a secondary, it's a means to an end, and the end is to make money. And you know, it's unfortunate. But for all of its faults and all of its challenges, it is clear, I think, that this industry is poised to meet them head on and succeed. Our industry in Virginia has consisted, as we've seen, of a series of events over 400 years, and change has proven the only constant in this narrative. And I posit that the best way for this industry to sort of move forward as we go through time is to follow that noblest of Virginia values, and that is to have the capacity to remember the lessons and understand the lessons of those who preceded us and the experiences of those who preceded us while freeing ourselves from their grasp. And I do believe that the winemakers and winery owners who have proven the most successful and admired, and you know who they are the ones that have focused on the people in the winemaking process and emphasize the strengths of their human capital. Those who surround themselves with family and friends, the ones that mentor others, the ones that show appreciation for employees and visitors and their neighbors are going to continue to enjoy the greatest competitive position. And I do hope that this continues to be an industry that is primarily comprised of families that are able to market a local farm-to-table product at the local level. Those families were key to the modern industry's rebirth, and I think will be the key, most assuredly, to its continued success. I'll close on this picture here. In 2011, the Virginia Tourism Corporation, for the first time, put a winery on the cover of its tourism guide. And that's pretty remarkable, because beforehand it had just been Virginia Beach and Mount Vernon, right? So that's how far we've come, and that concludes my prepared remarks. Be happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Andrew. If there are any questions in the audience, I can come up with the microphone if anybody has them. Sure, we've got one up there. Okay.
If you could only, this is my first time in Virginia, and I can only go to 4 wineries.
That's tough.
Where am I going?
You know, I think you need to select wineries that that are large and small. I like Zephaniah, a winery like Zephaniah, which is small, family-owned. Right down the street is Stone Tower, which is making very high-quality grapes and high-quality wine. I'm sorry? Well, Lou Parker, yeah. Yeah, Lou's great. It is, and both Zephaniah, Willowcroft, and Stone Tower are all right there. You can go up to Leesburg and get that experience. I do think you need to go down to Charlottesville. You should go to Jefferson just to pay homage to Philip Mattei in Jefferson. You should go to Barbersville, which is, again, that first European major planting and major investment. And, the stories of the opposition they had. I mean, it was reported that an adjacent farmer who didn't like what they were doing burned down the sheep barn in which they were storing all of the wine, casks of wine, which is an important, it's crazy. But go down to Southwest Virginia. In Bedford County, there is a winery, which name escapes me, but it's in Bedford, and they are producing fruit wines. They have like 30 different fruit wines, which is Peaks of Otter Winery, all sorts of wine. They've got a hot chili pepper wine, for example. And the one thing I would advise anyone that's trying out Virginia wine is don't be a grape snob. I mean, we all drink what you like, but experience the local culture, the local, some of these people are producing wine. They love doing this stuff. And it might not meet your expectations in terms of quality, but there's a lot of love that goes into the production of these wines. So that doesn't, I mean, I've given you a lot more than 4, but, you know.
Where's your table full of books that you're going to sell and sign to?
There's going to be I guess a book signing at the bookstore right after lunch, between 1 and, I can only unfortunately stay to 2 o'clock. Unfortunately, our babysitter canceled us, so I've got to get back up to Northern Virginia, to Mary Ann, but I'll be there between 1 and 2, and it's there. But it took me 10 years to write this book, and like I said, when I started, I knew nothing about the wine industry in Virginia, but now I feel like it's sort of an outsider looking into the industry, and it's really been an honor getting to know some of these people. So.
What kind of economic conditions can constitute the price? Why is the price of a bottle of Virginia wine not super competitive?
I'd be lying if I said I was an expert on that. I'm not, unfortunately. I wish I could answer that, but I can't. If I had my notes here, I'd be prepped and prepared to answer. And it's something I should be able to rattle off, but I just don't know.
So I had you for Metropolitan Problems. It was one of my favorite courses in undergrad, and I've enjoyed this. I'm curious where you're going next. Like, what is your next big thing to study?
The next big thing is for you to take the test right outside of this. The blue books are over in the bookstore. I have to be honest. I practice law. Mary Ann has been trying to get me. She basically said, I don't know what got you starting this thing in 2008, but this thing's got to end. So for the next year or so, it's going to be talks like this. I think I would love to get back into teaching. It's been a long time since I've taught here at Mary Washington. That's my favorite course. I enjoyed it too. Who the heck knows what little Renaissance things I'm going to come up with. I have no idea. But you're very kind. Thank you very much.
Well, let's give another round of applause to Andrew. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And hopefully we'll see some of you at the wine and beer tasting later this afternoon over at the Alumni Center. Thanks for coming out.
All right.